Well, I want to welcome you here. I see we've got this is the brave part of Washington that showed up during this terrible period. I'm sure more people will be coming in, but thank you for joining us. And let me say that the object here is to really take an intense look at the elections in Brazil. In other words, to really try to look as hard as we can what's going on, what's going to be the nature of the campaign from here on in, what are the possibilities of different combinations, and try to understand where then, that may be mainly your job, is to where then does Brazil go from here? And it's all a lot to cover. We have an hour and a little bit to do so in. But let me start out by just saying that we're doing this in collaboration with the Latin American program of Johns Hopkins University. And we're fortunate to have the head of the Latin American program here with us today. One of two great experts that are going to join us and answer the question I just raised. Monica is well known to a lot of people here, and she just recently became the director of Johns Hopkins. She's maintaining her position as senior fellow. Tell me if I get anything wrong, Monica. Okay. At the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and let me sum up her career by just saying she's really one of Brazil's leading, most respected economists, and she's also become a really sought-after political analyst in the process, particularly of this election, I just say that this is the beginning of, I hope, collaboration between the dialogue and Johns Hopkins on particularly the issue of Brazil, but other things as well. And welcome back here. She's been here quite often. Our second speaker is Mauricio Mora. Like Monica, he's trained in economics, and
not like Monica, but I was trained.
Well. Similar to, or approximately, but he's involved into one of Brazil's really leading pollsters, researchers on politics, political analysts, all a hobby, of course. And he sort of the CEO and founder of an institution that you should understand what it is by its name, Idea Big Data. That really sort of, he dives very deeply into the data, and he actually draws conclusions from it, which is very helpful. Let me just also say, I think all of you here recognize what a difficult time this is for Brazil now. We have an economy that's extremely wobbly, barely recovering from several years of deep recession, a pervasive, multifaceted corruption scandal that has spilled over into Latin America and affected virtually all parties and a big share of the political world in Brazil. And third, this sort of one senses, and we'll hear a lot about this, I think, today, a general loss of confidence in the country's leadership and its institutions and its government. And the election, people have been waiting for the election for a long time as sort of a possible path out of this sort of rather dismal situation that Brazil finds itself. And now we see that the election may be, and you'll hear more about this, and contributing to the problems. And that we see the person who was leading in the polls until recently is in jail and is ineligible to run, Lula da Silva. He has a standing candidate now, but it's not Lula. People wanted to vote for Lula. And on the other hand, you have a right-wing, extreme right-wing candidate who is now leading in the polls. And he was just the subject of a sort of a life-threatening attack, and he's just recovering and restarting his campaign. Those are two things. And lastly, it's interesting that if you look at the list of candidates that are running for president and have some reasonable chance of winning, almost all of them have larger negative reaction. The number of people who say they will never vote for them is higher than the people that say they will vote for them. I think that includes almost every competitive candidate, which gives you a feel. But in any event, I think that I'd like to, turn it over to Mauricio to start us off and, tell us what do the polls look like, who is likely to get into the second round now, and then where do we go from there?
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for the invitation. Good morning, Monica. I want to say like 4 topics about what I'm seeing right now. As of today, we have numbers in a daily basis. So every day there is a new poll, a public poll. We have our private tracking. There are 4 issues that I want to mention. First of all, we see, as you mentioned, the right-wing candidate very consolidated in the first place. And who are his voters right now? Basically, the middle and the upper class in Brazil, with higher education, higher income, big cities. This is a group of voters that used to vote for PSDB in the last 4 elections. Now they are voting for Bolsonaro. What PSDB lost in this election was the people that make more than 10 minimum wages in Brazil. So to have an idea, Alckmin has 4% with people that gains more than 10 minimum wages. So what we call the A class or upper class. So they lost these people. On the second issue is the PT candidate that we were mentioning. We had Lula with 35 points on the surveys, on the pollings, but now Haddad, his number is about 20%, 21%, 22%, depends on the source. But what happened is that they focused the campaign, the resources, the communication, the grassroots, everything on the Northeast. So Haddad is only leading in one region of Brazil right now, the Northeast. And then this is the other extreme of the voters. We are talking about the lowest income segment, really the popular vote. They are leading in the small cities in Brazil, especially, and we have a lot of those small cities in the north and the northeast. So we're talking about the 2 spectrums of the voters when you compare the voters of Bolsonaro and Haddad today. Of course, we have about 15% of the voters that would only vote for Lula. We hear that a lot on the focus groups. Oh, I don't vote for Haddad or anyone. I want to vote for Lula. Last time I voted for someone that Lula recommended, that was Dilma. The end was not so. We have these people. Otherwise, Haddad would have the same amount of potential votes that Lula used to have. On the second, so those are very consolidated because are those the 2 extremes of voters in Brazil. And then we have Ciro, that is interesting because half of these votes are for the high income class, what we call the more progressive voters. Those voters used to vote for PT as well. And then he got some of the people that used to vote for Lula and not vote for Haddad, especially because he's claiming that he will help people that are in debt. In Brazil, there is a blacklist for someone that's owned money. And he said he's going to manage to work with that. So this is a good point, and he's managed to keep his 10, 11, 12, depends on the. So, and on the other hand, this is the 4th point, as you mentioned, the level of rejection of the PT and Bolsonaro are very high. Very, very high. To have an idea, no presidential candidate in Brazil was elected with more than 40% of rejection. Depends on the pool. Both of them have more than 40% of rejection. So we go to a situation that really they're extremes. And that has the one big implication that I saw. That's the no vote in Brazil. So there's a lot of people that or they go to the ballot and don't the blank vote, or they don't vote for anyone, or they don't show up. And this is increasing in Brazil in every election. And if we have two extreme candidates in that sense in the second round, actually who's going to decide the election is not someone that's going to vote, but the decisive point would be who actually is going to show up to vote. Remember that in 2014 we had 37 million people that didn't vote in the second round. And this year I think it's going to be higher. So we are tracking, just a number and statistics that doesn't mean anything. Every day in Brazil, about 200,000 people go to Google and ask, what happened if I don't vote? That's the question. And this is growing. We start the campaign with 75,000 people per day. Now we're talking about 200,000 people per day, just looking at options. I don't want to vote, how to do the blank vote. So there is a lot of ground. There's no vote. Actually, the no vote today actually is going to be not only in the presidential election, but on the state elections, the no vote is going to be the winner. I'm sure about that. So that goes to my conclusion that anyone that wins is going to win with the good scenario with 1/3 of the population. Because 1/3 is not going to show up. 1/3 most likely is going to vote against the candidate that wins. And the other third is going to be the support base of the new president. And one thing that 2014 taught for politics in Brazil is that if you want to reform anything in Brazil, you need to work with the losers of the election. That's a fact.
Right.
So, and that's my biggest concern about everything that's going on. And Bolsonaro is basically not only the anti-PT reflection, he's the anti-system, anti-political system. So people that vote for him is basically voting because they don't like anything that's out there. And he managed to put in the voters' mind that the corrupt politician is the same as a drug dealer on the streets. So everything is a mess. They are the enemy, and I want to change the system. Yesterday, Bolsonaro gave an interview for a radio in Brazil from the hospital, and he said very clearly, I'm going to be elected to break the system. And he said like 5 times. And this is the main argument for people that it's not a rational argument. It's not about the proposals. It's not about the economy. It's about people that are tired of the system. So that's what I always call this election in Brazil is very similar to the election in the U.S. in the sense of the voters are very angry. There's a lot of anger and fear in Brazil right now on the election.
Let me just ask you one quick question, though. In other words, you mentioned the upper class and the elites, the educated, the people with more money are voting for Bolsonaro. Now, they're voting for him when the system basically has rewarded them, even if it's a system that they dislike, etc. Why are they prepared to elect a candidate that will undo a system that sort of rewarded them so handsomely?
No, the elite actually is swallowing Bolsonaro today. But this is the movement that starts in the middle class. But the middle class, the Bolsonaro core voters come from the middle class that are very tired of the politics at all. But when he starts grows on the polls, I have the same feeling, kind of a deja vu. In 2002, I was working in financial markets, and I saw the process of people accepting Lula. It was a process. And they had some way the same arguments that they have with Bolsonaro right now. He's not prepared, he doesn't have experience, he didn't do anything. That was Lula in 2002. But by the time the election was approaching and people seeing that Lula had a lot of chances to win, the elite start to accept the fact that Lula could be a president. And right now, the elite already accepted the fact that Bolsonaro could be a president. But his movement began in the middle class, not in the upper class. That's all.
Monica?
Well,
Where does this leave us?
let me first thank you for starting us off on this two-part series. We're going to have another event on the elections after the second round joint Inter-American Dialogue and SAIS Latin American Studies program. That will be on October 30th. We will send around, of course, the logistics of that. But so this is a two-part series. We decided to hold this one event before the first round so that we could discuss a little bit what the scenarios are looking like. And then we're going to have another one where after the fact, we can then look forward and try to say something about where the country's going. So let me thank Peter for partnering with us, and I hope that this is a continuous engagement on many fronts, because the challenges ahead are going to be quite substantial. Let me just step back a bit, and before I talk about, sort of what the implications are of this extreme polarization that we're seeing in Brazil, let me try to say something very briefly, because I think a lot of analysis still needs to be done for us to draw any conclusions. Well, let me try to say something about how we got here. And let me go back 5 years to 2013, when Brazil was having, all of a sudden, sort of seemingly out of nowhere, a lot of protests and a lot of demonstrations just swept the country in June, July of 2013. Those protests didn't quite have a focus. There were people protesting about many different things, bus fares and other issues. But there was a real sense that there was a level of dissatisfaction overall in the country with the way that things were going. However, at that time, since the protests were not about, the political system per se, or about Dilma's government per se, it was just a general feeling of dissatisfaction. It was a moment when political parties looking back, should have taken that signaling, that moment, to rethink about their role and think about themselves with a view to, what's going to happen to the country going forward. Unfortunately, in Brazil, as everywhere, politicians tend to be very myopic, so nobody had the sense to really think things through. And then, everything was overtaken by a turn of, or by a wave of very serious events. So we went down the path of increased polarization. We had the corruption scandals, which made that even worse. We had Rousseff's impeachment, which is something that I think scholars and political scientists and economists alike, and political economists are going to be revisiting for a very long time, because this had massive implications, I think, for what we're seeing happen right now in Brazil in terms of this degree of polarization. The corruption scandals, and to an extent, the politicization of the judiciary, which had been seen as the one branch in government that hadn't been contaminated by politics. Well, now, it's hard to argue that it hasn't. So institutions are in a state of complete disarray in Brazil. And out of this complete disarray, arose this extreme polarization that we're seeing in the country. It's interesting that when we go back, and Mauricio and I had been for quite some time saying that this outcome, of having possibly a runoff scenario with one extreme, Bolsonaro, and another extreme, whoever would become the candidate for the PT, that was becoming increasingly likely. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you faced the same thing I did. Whenever we said these things, we got a lot of pushback, and people would generally just say back to us, no, that's not how Brazil works. Ultimately, Brazil always finds a moderate solution, some centrist candidates, some middle of the way, and that's ultimately how these elections are going to go. Well, it turns out that both of us, and I don't want to take credit for things that I don't have to take credit for. It wasn't just both of us. There were other people saying this, but both of us were right. I mean, we have moved in the direction where things have gone in the extreme polarized direction. There's still some slim chance that a centrist candidate could arise, but that window is closing very fast, especially when you look at, as Mauricio was saying before, as you look at the trends that you see in the polls. So when you look at the trends in the polls, Bolsonaro seems to now have stabilized. He's the front runner. He's stable, has a massive rejection rate. Haddad, on the other hand, has risen quite a bit. There's an interesting phenomenon here because with the extreme anti-Bolsonaro vote in the PT camp now and the extreme anti-PT vote in the Bolsonaro camp now, what we have seen with the rise of the PT candidate is that a lot of people who we thought could perhaps vote for Bolsonaro, but they weren't going to be vocal about it. So the hidden Bolsonaro voter, just like the hidden Trump voter that we spoke of in 2016, we thought that voter was going to play a particularly determining role in this election. Well, these people have now, and these are the elites, they're now not ashamed to say that they're going to vote for Bolsonaro. So the hidden Bolsonaro voter is actually not hidden anymore. What I think is somewhat hidden still is the hidden PT voter. So those who are staunchly against Bolsonaro and who will vote PT just not to see Bolsonaro in. So that's the situation we have right now. I mean, it's not just a matter of those who are voting for Bolsonaro are voting with conviction. Those who are voting for PT are voting with conviction. There's actually this repudiation vote that's driving this election, and that's very serious. That might mean, as Mauricio was saying, that ultimately, whomever gets elected by a relatively small share of the votes because of the sheer number of blank and no votes that are going to be possibly the outcome of a runoff between Bolsonaro and Haddad. What that also means, of course, is statistically speaking, the candidate that has the lowest rejection rate is the one that's likeliest to win, which is something that's also kind of disturbing. If you're electing somebody just on the basis of their rejection rate, not on the basis of the actual support that they have. Which brings me to then Peter's question, which is, how do we then see things going forward as one of these two, if it is indeed one of these two that's going to get elected? Well, here's where it confounds me completely when I talk to people in Brazil, because a lot of people seem to think that by voting for, say, Bolsonaro, they're guaranteeing some kind of stability for Brazil, whatever that means. And I don't see quite the same type of argument being made for PT, but there's a sense that some of that might be in there too. What I see is the stark opposite of that. So what I see is a situation where no matter who wins, we're going to have some level of turmoil in the country. This is so as not to use the word chaos, simply because I think it's become such a cliche these days that I don't use it anymore. So I think we're going to see some level of turmoil. And what we're really trying to assess is how much turmoil are we going to see, depending on which of these two candidates ends up winning. And here's where, the anti-sentiment really matters. Because if you have a large segment of the population that's really galvanized to vote against Bolsonaro because they strongly believe that because of the things that he said in the past, and he's very fiery and very divisive, he may actually be putting human rights and other rights in danger. There's going to be a women's march on the 29th, so this coming Saturday, all over the country in Brazil before the elections, which is very telling. So you have a segment of the Brazilian population that really is very mobilized in the case that Bolsonaro ends up winning. What does that do? Well, obviously, you can see a scenario where, if Bolsonaro is elected, the next day you have protests all over the country. And you have a situation where basically the country becomes very difficult to govern, including because, and this is something we can't forget, Bolsonaro is a candidate in a shell party. His party is a shell. It's not like the PSTB of the past. It's not even like the current PT, which has been considerably watered down and considerably weakened, but it is still a party that has, whether you agree with it or not, it has an ideology. It has substance. Whereas Bolsonaro's party simply doesn't. It's a platform for him to get elected.
I would say more a vision than an ideology.
of vision. Fine. Okay, ideology is another very charged word these days, so we'll avoid that too. But in any event, so you have, him with his shell political party, mobilization against him, the lack of support that he's likely to have, at least initially, the difficulties that he's going to have dealing with Congress, and the things that he said about Congress in the past, and the things that he said about democracy in Brazil, the way that he has presented, his view about how democratic institutions in Brazil don't work, and therefore the sense that he might do something about that. All of that is going to generate extreme mobilization. So I can't see a scenario where Bolsonaro gets elected and there's no turmoil. By the same token, I think there's a very clear case to make of a scenario where Haddad gets elected and there's a lot of turmoil. And here I want to bring back to mind, just to remind everyone here, of the trucker strike that we had in Brazil back in May. The trucker strike, which basically paralyzed the country for about 2 weeks and had massive economic consequences in a situation where the economy was already pretty weak. A lot of the truckers, as they were coming on TV and speaking and being interviewed and so on during the strike, they manifested themselves as being Bolsonaro supporters. Now imagine a situation where you have PT being elected, and then you get a strike like that immediately after PT is elected. So this is the sort of situation that is bound to happen, given that we've gone to the most extreme scenario possible if a runoff between Bolsonaro and Haddad is what we're looking at. On top of that, we have all of the economic problems that Brazil has to deal with. Brazil is on a clearly unsustainable fiscal trajectory. It needs to do immediate fiscal adjustment. It needs to do immediate reforms to resolve this growing debt to GDP. These are very difficult reforms to pass in Congress. We saw that not happen in the Temer administration. Temer being someone who knows how to operate within the Brazilian Congress, knows exactly how the Brazilian political system functions, and yet he was not able to deliver on many of his promises. Why do we think that either Bolsonaro or Haddad, with the extreme difficulties that they're going to have negotiating with Congress, are going to be able to deliver anything, even if they, ultimately are forced into doing something because markets are going to be turbulent. So I think we're looking at a situation where the country is more likely than not at this point to tip into economic turmoil, possibly an economic crisis, possibly something worse than what we saw in 2015 and 2016, because now what we're really talking about is having to face the fiscal problems that have been averted thus far. Markets will not allow that to happen anymore come 2019. So let me end there because there's a lot more to say.
No, just many things. First of all, it's interesting because this is the only scenario that Bolsonaro can win, to have PT as an opponent, and the only scenario that PT can win having Bolsonaro as an opponent. So it's interesting that it's like Hillary and Trump. The only possibility Trump win was against Hillary and the other way around. In that sense, it's interesting that PT itself, and on the PT, they made a government plan to go to the opposition. I don't know if you have time to read the PT platforms this election, but in their minds, it's going to be very difficult to win this election. So they have, of course, and for them, going to a runoff is a big win, political win. 2 years ago, they suffered an impeachment in the presidency, and they lost 500 election, the municipal election. So they're going to go out of this election winning 5 states, and I can tell you, Bahia, Ceará, Piauí, Acre, Rio Grande do Norte. They're going to most likely win 5 states in the same region, especially in the Northeast. They are going to elect a lot of senators, including Dilma, just for Dilma is back. So, and they're in their accounts, they're gonna elect around 40 to 50 in the Congress, in the lower house. They elected 70 in 2014. They're gonna lose, but they're gonna be a major fuss. So for them, if they go to the second round, it's already a winning situation. Actually, I heard from senior leadership in PT that actually being the government right now is going to be much worse for PT than being the opposition. Because imagine they're going to have to face all the troubles with lack of political capital. For them, it's the best scenario is to go to the opposition and put themselves as the most important opposition party. On the other way around, Bolsonaro, as far as I know, they're not prepared to win at all. Bolsonaro, in that sense, is very similar to Trump. Winning is a risk for them. So, and he's not prepared at all. He doesn't have a political group. He basically spent the last 10 years in his political life with his basically family around him. He's the first time in history that he didn't find an economist. The economist found him. So it's kind of found him so it's with dynamics. But I want just to conclude that the winning on the lower house is not going to be PT, it's not going to be MDB or PSDB. What they call the center, all the political parties that are always transitioning from, and they are always in power and transition, they're going to be bigger. And that has the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that anything that you go to Congress now, you're going to have to work much harder with those parties. I'm talking PSD, PP, DEM, Solidariedade, PROS, there's a lot of, but the good news that I always tell this outside Brazil, it's very hard to do anything, any radicalism or any extreme measure with the center there. Because if you push to one extreme to the other, they kind of work on that. Or they're going to be in the power with the president, that I think is the most likely scenario. Remember, Bolsonaro spent 12 years of his political career at PP. PP is the heart of the corruption, the center, or they're going to take him out. So the center is going to be heavily in the Brazilian Congress next year. So that's going to be a big issue for Bolsonaro, for the bad and for the good. So that's a...
Yeah. For the bad, just to pick up on the bad, of course, goes back to what I was saying. It means policy paralysis. It means policy paralysis to an extent that will be even greater than what we've been seeing happen in Brazil to this point. And like I said, Brazil desperately needs to implement a lot of policies and a lot of reforms. So this is where,
Unless Bolsonaro bring them to the government.
Unless Bolsonaro brings them to the government, which would be in direct clash with the economic proposals that he has. Because one of the linchpins of his economic/political something, because it's not quite a plan, is that he would cut down substantially on the ministries. Now, we know how coalitional presidentialism operates in Brazil. You need a significant number of ministries because that's how you maintain a solid coalition in place. If you're going to shrink the number of ministries, you're going to have a much, much harder time doing that. So either he's going to renege on that campaign promise from day one, which is obviously not going to go down very well with markets, or he's going to keep the promise and make it even more difficult for himself to govern. So this is another point that I think is very much worth mentioning. The Brazilian, private sector in Brazil and the Brazilian financial markets seem to be having an extremely complacent view with respect to what might happen under a Bolsonaro government, whereas they have an extremely radical view in terms of what might happen under a PT government. And my point here is that the troubles are just as serious. They may just turn out or come out in different ways.
Before we go on, I'm going to open it up to questions very quickly. But Mauricio, you mentioned very briefly that the campaign was going to be an anti-campaign. I wonder, since we won't have the next session of the Hopkins dialogue before tell me, can you just elaborate, take a couple of minutes what is the campaign going to look like?
Yes. The second round is another cliche, is a different election. But the key for the second round in Brazil is basically a referendum. And the key to win a second round is to put the question of the referendum more clearly for the public. And what I see is that Bolsonaro has the easiest question to put in the second round. That would be, do you want PT back or not? So, and that's a very, and everything that PT says, he's going to say, you didn't do it. You didn't deliver. You didn't do it. You didn't. So he's not going to propose anything in the second round. He's going to basically, everything that PT comes, he's going to say, you guys didn't do it. You guys didn't. So, and the PT has a much more complicated question to do. They can go to, do you want a dictator or not? Or do you want a Brazilian version of Trump or not? So it's much more complicated to them. They could go to if his health conditions are not in place, and I don't think it's the case, he's getting better. They said, we're going to vote to a vice president again or not. But it's going to be very easy for campaigning for Bolsonaro in the second round. It's all about PT. We're going to spend 3 weeks talking about PT. Nobody's going to discuss the Brazilian problems. We're going to discuss the problems of PT. So that's a very easy question to put out. On top of that, one thing that PT fears is that they have the biggest infrastructure on the ground in the Northeast. And most of the governments that I mentioned here, they're not going to have second rounds, the runoff. So it's going to be much more complicated to mobilize people in the states and PT does very well. So it's going to be very complicated for them. And on top of that, they have, on the rejection side, PT has almost 70% of rejection in the Southeast, São Paulo, Rio, and Minas. And it's impossible to win an election with that rejection in places that have a lot of votes like that. And even in Rio, that PT used to win, Bolsonaro is leading. Bolsonaro is leading Rio, São Paulo, Minas. So it's going to be very hard for them in the second round. And they're going to have to explain themselves for 3 weeks. They say that this is the bad thing, but the good thing, they say they're going to defend that legacy. So let's see.
Yeah, just one observation on that. I agree with everything that Mauricio said. But I do think that Bolsonaro, if the PT plays it well, there's a lot to put him on the defensive about too. He has made extreme statements. He has made extreme statements about democracy in Brazil. He has made extreme statements about the military dictatorship. He has made extreme statements about the institutional, the rejection of institutions, as it were, as a whole. And this is not even going into the statements that he's made about women, about broader civil liberties and so on. So there is a lot that he's going to have to answer for too. And this is where I think, because his rhetoric, throughout since the 90s has been broadly the same with respect to all of these themes, these things are going to keep coming out. And these are exactly the attacks that he has been receiving throughout. Whether that's going to be enough to sort of flip the situation, I tend to agree with Mauricio. I think probably not, but we don't know.
The funny thing is that the Bolsonaro's tracking record of votes in the Congress are very similar to the PT in terms of economics. So it's they're very close to.
Let me just ask one last question. There's been a lot of comparisons, intentional and maybe not so intentional, with Donald Trump and Bolsonaro. And so the question is, Donald Trump, you have to see, has gotten control over the Republican Party, is basically able to carry out an agenda, and it's hard to stop. And you mentioned the Centrão as being sort of, now is that a likely, is it likely that he could get control of the Centrão, or is
the Centrão is open 24 hours for business? Depends on.
And Bolsonaro presumably has the political astuteness, ability to manage that.
The comparison with Trump, there are some things that are similar, some things that are not. The things that are similar, he runs a campaign against the system, so against everything is wrong. He doesn't believe in the electoral system. He's now saying that the voting machines in Brazil are fraud. So that's the same. He has a lot of fights with media. Everything that people say that he doesn't like is fake news. So it's that narrative is very. But of course, and also Trump used to communicate with much more the blue collar, white collar workers in the U.S. Bolsonaro talks to the more educated people, so that's a big difference and of course he doesn't have a party, as Monica is saying. His party doesn't exist at all. And if they're lucky, they're gonna elect 30 people in the lower house in the best case scenario. But the question is, the Centrão is gonna be there, as always has been in the last 50 years of Brazilian politics. But the question mark for me is what he's going to do. Because if he starts dealing with Centrão, he's going to actually, on top of everything that Monica said, is going to hurt his base. Because one thing that Trump has never done here is to hurt his base of voters. He's basically, in a sense, delivering what he promised to his base. If Bolsonaro tries to negotiate with Centrão, he's going to move exactly in the opposite direction of what he promised in the campaign. So that's a big issue to governability.
Yeah, I'll just push back slightly on that to say that I think some of these comparisons, they do well on the surface, you know, sort of looking at the messages that Bolsonaro has been putting out, the anti-press stuff, you know, the questioning of the election, saying that the system's rigged, all that kind of stuff. Those strategies all sound very similar, but Bolsonaro is the product of Brazil and Brazil alone. He's a purely Brazilian phenomenon. He personifies exactly the sort of reactionary, as in, you know, extremist, rightist, statist, interventionist. You know, he personifies that aspect of Brazilian politics that hasn't really ever gone away. And when you look at Brazilian history, you know, we do have these waves of, you know, every 20, 30 years perhaps, we flirt with the idea of having one of these people back in power. That's sort of the personification of Bolsonaro. And the fact that he has the support of the elites is also very Brazilian in that sense. So I think, you know, there are lots of elements here to unpack. But broadly speaking, he's a product of what Brazil has always been and of what Brazil has become because of a host of things that have happened in the country in the past few years.
Okay, now we're going to open it up to questions. Oh, too many. Teresa, why don't you start us off?
Question for Mauricio. You know, Alckmin...
Tell us who you are.
Teresa Terminacian, formerly the director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF and longtime friend of Brazil. My question is, you know, Alckmin was banking on a sort of broad coalition with the Central. Why didn't that work?
I think Alckmin has I saw a positive thing because Alckmin was the only candidate that went to the campaign and said, in order to deliver the reforms, we need the Congress. He was the only one actually saying that clearly because he met the Central. First of all, there are many things. Alckmin himself was in a very bad situation because this corruption scandal of Lava Jato is very connected with his party, especially with the leadership, Aécio Neves. So by the time they didn't do anything with Aécio Neves after all the scandals, they lost a lot of credibility, especially with the middle class voters. On top of that, so that for itself is going to be very difficult to sell a PSDB candidate with all this Lava Jato scandals. On top of that, they had a lot of those Centrão parties. They have those regional issues. So sometimes they are supporting PT. There's one of the big parties of the Centrão is supporting PT in his local state, and the other party is supporting Ciro, and the other one is flirting with Bolsonaro. So the regional agenda is, if you don't have a candidate that's clearly leading the polls and clearly leading to be the next president, they start to put the local agenda in front of playing for Alckmin. But on top of that, what I was always seeing on the polls that it was going to be very hard for the PSDB, but even harder to PSDB to deliver with someone that's kind of Alckmin is a politician, a real traditional politician For example, 10 years ago, when I used to watch political campaigns in Brazil, the politician starts the campaign showing their resume. Oh, this guy was mayor, was congressman, was senator, was governor. If you put this on TV right now, people are going to see and see, oh my God, he has been stealing for us from 30 years. So he has a political career, and this is not what the public opinion was looking at this moment. So he didn't gain ground, and then the Central started working with his local issues, and now the Central is talking to PT, talking to Bolsonaro. They're always moving, so it's kind of.
Well, let's go over here in the back. Go tell us.
Yeah, hello. I'm Roberto Jimenez from El Salvador, but I follow very close Brazilian politics. Okay, Monica, to you. This guy who is the economic advisor of Bolsonaro, the guy, he said, I had no idea what economic is. Ask him, this guy. He will speak on my behalf. Who is he? Mauricio, this is a challenge for the electoral, what you call marqueteiros. You have to soften the image of Bolsonaro to be more drinkable to anybody there. How are they doing there? Because they will change there. The votes in Brazil is very voluble. They changed a lot. 30 days ago, well, we know very well, Mireles went to the bottom, Alckmin went to the bottom. We know it's Bolsonaro, Ciro, or Haddad. We know that. In the second round, Bolsonaro, the only one that he beat is Marina Silva, who now is going down there. So we know that the three of them are going up. Monica, to you. The speech of the guy of the Tribunal Supremo, it was so politicized that he didn't look like a lawyer. He looked as a politician from the PT there. Tell me something about that, the judicial there.
I guess that's enough questions for this round.
He's talking about Paulo.
So let me start with Paulo Guedes, who is the economic advisor for Bolsonaro and presumably his super minister, because he supposedly will unite a whole bunch of ministries under him. So he will be finance minister, planning minister, and possibly industry and commerce minister all at once, given this effort to sort of streamline the number of ministries in Brazil. He's not an academic. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago. He's an old timer, Chicago boy in many ways. His economic views are pro-market, small state, and here I have to make this joke because it just comes back to me every time that I talk about Paulo Guedes. So in Brazil we had this very famous journalist who said this fantastic phrase once, which was, you know, when ideas get really old, they retire and they go live in Brazil. That's exactly what Paulo Guedes represents in terms of, coming back to this. The state should be as small as possible. You should have, pro-market policies. You should privatize everything. So he's talking about, privatizing. I don't know exactly how he intends to do this, but he wants to raise R$1 trillion, and this is how he's going to fix Brazil's fiscal problems. So this is how he's been speaking, and that's who he is. He doesn't really have a coherent plan. When you look at the actual economic plan that Bolsonaro his campaign has published, there are lots of question marks in there. Because Brazil has these massive, there was talk of, and other people who form part of the elites in Brazil, who have basically been very vocal about saying, well, actually, I might vote for Bolsonaro even in the first round. I am definitely going to vote for him in the second round because my vote is anti-PT, but maybe I'll even vote for him in the first round just to make sure that, there's no chance of PT ever coming back into power. So that's why I made the comment I made earlier, which was to say, this voter, which would probably be leaning somewhere else, and certainly would have been ashamed to say, to some extent, that they were going to be voting for Bolsonaro 6 months ago. This voter now is coming out and saying, well, this is what I just might do because I simply don't want to see PT back. What's interesting is that you don't really see the other voters, so the ones who would vote, let's say, more center-left, you don't really see those people saying right now that they're going to support PT. So that's why I personally think this is just my personal, not based on anything, it's just on observations alone. This is why I'm starting to think that the hidden PT voter is actually something that we don't know much of, whereas the hidden the hidden Bolsonaro voter, we now sort of have a better idea of who he or she is.
Yeah. Now, talking about the three issues of these elections are, as always, the economy. And the argument that PT does for their core base is an economic argument. They say you're going to be happy again as you were during the Lula times. It's basically an economic argument that they are doing. And also the other two are security. There's a big discussion in Brazil about violence, security, and Bolsonaro is winning that discussion, especially in the mind of the voters. And the last one, and it's the worst one for PT, is the corruption. So, and all the anti-PT vote is mobilized by the corruption, the sentiment against corruption. So those are the three. So depends, the PT is going to come up with, and also the Paulo Guedes, they're already using the argument that Paulo Guedes is a banker. So if he wins, he's gonna be the banker against the poor. That's the narrative that's going to come. About the parties, who's going to support who? I have no clue.
Yeah, let me add my voice to that. I mean, I have sort of a sense that given that this has become, if this is what we're going to face, the most extreme of the extremes, I suspect that many parties will simply not position themselves.
My sense, if I have just like completely, like Monica was saying, completely personal, is that the Centrão is much more likely to say that they're going to be with the PT now, because if they don't support PT now, it's going to be much harder to support after the election.
Yeah.
Because they know that Bolsonaro will need them. So I see some movements for the PT, because it's like if PT wins, and I don't show up before the election, it's going to be very hard to negotiate. But if Bolsonaro wins, he's going to need us. So that's
Let me just ask quickly. I mean, corruption has been a big issue in Brazil for quite a while now. Does either candidate really have any sort of serious plan for dealing with it?
I haven't heard any serious plan for Bolsonaro yet.
No. Neither side.
Will the Lava Jato continue, or?
Well, the Lava Jato, we have been seeing already that the Lava Jato has been considerably weakened recently.
It's important to notice that there's a lot of public employees, the Lava Jato, they're showing public support for Bolsonaro, especially in the social media. And that also helps his case.
But no, we haven't seen, I mean, echoing Mauricio, we haven't seen any consistent or coherent plans from other side about dealing with corruption.
He said yesterday on the radio interview that for the first time in the history he's going to choose technical ministers. So they're not going to have political appointees. So that's what he said yesterday. So.
We'll take three more, and then we'll see how much time we have, if we can have another round. Please.
Hello, I'm Carlos Gustavo Poggio. I'm a visiting scholar at Georgetown University from Brazil. And thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. I must say I came here very concerned, very worried, and now I'm desperate. I think I'm 10 times more concerned than when I came. So I have two quick questions. The first one, do you see any scenario that the second round is not Bolsonaro versus Haddad? I mean, this is a very volatile election. There's lots of undecided voters. Bolsonaro is in the first place with only 25% of the vote. Right. And the second question is, do you see any role for social media in these elections?
The gentleman right behind you.
Thank you. I'm Peter Meyer with the Congressional Research Service. What's the profile of a Centrão voter? What sort of draws them to those parties, and why, after Lava Jato, has there not been a larger reaction against those parties in terms of Congress?
Right here, gentleman in the dull gray sweater.
Thank you. How are you? I'm Carlos Guerrero from Mexico City. My question is that based on what you've been arguing here, is Bolsonaro creating a narrative to challenge the results of the election in the case he loses, either the first or the second round?
Who goes first? Mauricio?
The profile of the voters. There's Brazil, as of today, we have seen the increased role of the evangelical voters in Brazil. So the first profile, and there is some specialists that say in Brazil, right now we have about 35% of the people that declare themselves evangelicals. And more important, those are the people that go to church every week, because Brazil has a big Catholic population, but they don't practice as much. The second one, there's a lot of people in the countryside of Brazil that support the Centrão, especially people that have the agriculture as their main economic activity. And there's and on top of that, the Centrão is gaining ground also with the people that support guns, and because in Brazil you can own a gun, but you cannot carry a gun. So those are the three biggest arguments of this voters. About Bolsonaro declaring, I think this is the worst thing that he can do for the democracy is after he got this accident, the first thing that he said is that I don't trust the election. This is terrible for any outcome. And someone has to tell me that he has chances to be president. So, because this is counterproductive for any scenario. So, and the social media, Bolsonaro is a social media case, clearly. He has been spreading his message through social media, but this election, like I was mentioning, what happened in Colombia and also in Mexico. We had a lot of the content being distributed by WhatsApp, the discussion, the content, the fake news, everything in the WhatsApp environment. And the Bolsonaro, because he doesn't have infrastructure, he doesn't have the time on TV, he had to maximize that. So it was a very important thing. And one thing that I always say in Brazil, that discussion, TV against social media, doesn't exist anywhere. Because today a good political campaign integrates everything. So that's especially because the political campaigns in Brazil are very short now, like 35 days. So you need to build your momentum, to build your grassroots, to build your case through the social media. There's no other option.
Yeah, let me pick up on that point and then go through the other questions. So this is the issue of TV versus social media is really interesting because we had more than a year ago, I remember being on a panel at the Brazil Institute. You were on that panel, and we were the dissonant voices because there were the two of us, and then there were three very well-known Brazilian political scientists on the stage, and they were talking about TV time and the importance of mandatory TV time in Brazil, and how that in the end was what was going to determine electoral outcomes. And Mauricio and I were pushing back saying, look, you're ignoring the role of a very important thing called social media and the penetration of smartphones in Brazil, which has grown massively between 2014 and 2018. And we are just in new territory. We don't know how this is really going to play out. And I think one of the things that we definitely did see was this integration that Mauricio is talking about. Of course, Bolsonaro was also helped in a way by the fact that, during his entire recovery, including now, he's been on the news the whole time. So TV has played a role in that regard. The mandatory TV campaigns as such haven't really done much. I mean, look at Alckmin. He's got 18 minutes on TV.
MDB as well.
And MDB as well. And it hasn't really done anything. So I think we really are in new territory. And as, sort of political scientists, economists, or people who work with politics, we need to understand that better. Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio has a group that is studying only this and looking at the impact of social media in the current Brazilian election. So there's a lot of interesting research coming out of that, which is nice to look at. On your other question about the second round and the possibility of having a different second round, it's narrowing. Does it still exist? It does. We can't say that it doesn't. Is it possible that you have, a candidate like Ciro Gomes, for example, who's the third, the third placed candidate? perhaps rising if he's seen as, let's say, the candidate who can actually remove PT from the second round, and therefore it being a runoff between somebody like him and Bolsonaro, in which case he would win, as the most recent polls have shown. I think that possibility still exists. It would be very helpful, in particular, given that this is an anti-Bolsonaro, anti-PT, the way that things are shaping up is that way. It would be very helpful if the polls actually were running scenarios that placed these candidates against one another. So not just a runoff between Bolsonaro and X candidate, that's not Haddad, but a scenario that is Haddad versus an X candidate, that's not Bolsonaro. The polls are not doing that. And this, of course, drives opinions a lot. If people were actually seeing, especially the anti-PT camp, if they could actually see that there were candidates out there who are likely to beat PT under a runoff scenario, maybe that would change things around. So I hope that somebody is, some pollster in Brazil is listening to this, because these scenarios are important and they're not being run.
I think they're not being published because
they're not being published. They should be. They should be, because that would give the electorate a fuller picture of what we're looking at, and we're not seeing the full picture. So that, I think, is an important point. On the narrative question and I fully agree with Mauricio. And I think the likelihood, as he said, we don't know yet what the messaging is going to be like. We can only guess at what the messaging is going to be like in a runoff. But given that Bolsonaro has already made this statement about the rigged election and the rigged system, I can see him continuing down that path very easily, including because, that's his style. He shoots from the hip, so to speak. Maybe not only literally, that's what he does. So, you can very much see him going down that path, which is a destructive one, no doubt, as Mauricio said.
Let me just ask one other question. What would be, in your view, a more positive outcome of the election? In other words, that Bolsonaro is defeated in a landslide and sort of doesn't get it, or that the PT and sort of are about even, or the PT gets slammed. In other words, is there any preferred or any sort of more positive outcome? I mean, it looks like that whatever the outcome, it's not going to be very, very positive. But is there a more positive? Is there a better path among the different paths that exist? They all take you.
Yeah. Trying to look at this objectively and not from a personal political preference perspective.
We wouldn't think you would think about it personally.
I think the way that the positive would be if we were to have a scenario that's not this polarized.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's the positive. If we can have a scenario, whether it involves Bolsonaro or Haddad, with someone else rather than Bolsonaro or Haddad, that would definitely be a positive. That's the only positive I can see. Because if you do go to the extremes have issues on both sides of the spectrum, which lead you to this very confounding situation of having the country split in half. And then, all the turmoil that brings. So for me, the positive is a scenario where you have somebody else in the runoff. But for that, I insist, we need to have the full information from the polls, and we don't have them.
One thing that I start hearing from the Centrão is that if one of those extremes play in a very bad situation in terms of relations with the Congress, that can be a possibility to have on the table to change the presidential system and to work with like prime minister. And this is something that depends on how they play. Could not be bad for Brazil in the long term. But I start hearing like 2 months ago. Can be on the table for them.
But basically, right now, the path is not looking like the best outcome.
No, it's not.
can take a couple of last questions. Timothy, Tim, and I can't remember your name
There's
again.
there's the lady there.
Okay, one last one more. Go ahead.
There's the lady.
Go ahead.
Timothy Towell, 30 years in the State Department, starting in the Kennedy administration. And more
We have 2
importantly,
minutes.
consul in Porto Alegre, Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, 72 to 74. Monica, this was a great thing. Monica mentioned something that got my attention. Bolsonaro's extreme statements will come back and might haunt him or us. What's the status of the theme of anti-Semitism in Brazil now? And does this impact on the election if he's said extreme statements in the past? You got a neighbor, Paraguay, where I was ambassador, and Vice President Pence called up the president of Paraguay screaming at him. Pence doesn't even know where South America is, because the Paraguayans, who have a huge Arabic population, including terrorists in Ciudad del Este in the Tri-Frontier area, move the embassy back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem. What is the impact of anti-Semitism on this election and the possibility this Bolsonaro will say naughty things?
This young lady here.
Hi, my name is Paula, and I'm an intern here, and I'm also from Brazil. And my question is, I've seen a lot of people saying that PT and Haddad should be like vice president of Ciro so they could be a stronger candidate coalition against Bolsonaro, and that PT didn't do that because they were aiming for power too hard, that they were keeping the Lula livre, free Lula speech. So do you think that that would have been, we would have seen a better scenario right now if PT had colluded with Ciro Gomes, for example?
And last question.
Hi, my name is Thalita. I'm a first year at a Master's of Foreign Service in Georgetown and also Brazilian. I wanted to ask, because we see this narrative in the media about two extreme opposites between PT and Bolsonaro. And I think some of the things Monica said talked about that. And I wanted to see why do you see them as opposites? Is it just because of the reaction of the anti-PT that we know it's very strong in Brazil, does it have anything to do with PT's plan? Because Bolsonaro is very extreme, very anti-system, homophobic, and I don't see that in PT's plan. And I wanted you to elaborate a bit more on that. Thank you.
May I start? So let me address your question point blank, because it is a very important one, and it's one that keeps coming back. No, I do not think they're opposites. The Alckmin campaign has actually been trying to play that, and it hasn't really worked, but has been trying to play that, one against the other, and has actually come out and said, they're two sides of the same coin. No, they're not. They're not two sides of the same coin. Yes, PT has some issues because it has some people within PT that have defended, the Venezuelan regime, for example. And this is where, the false equivalency comes in, because really, PT is for all its problems and for all the troubles that it has and for all the people that populate it that do defend authoritarian regimes, the fact is that party did govern the country for 13 years under democracy. So they're not equivalent in any sense of the word. The way by which you see them as opposites is simply because that's the way that the Brazilian electorate has positioned itself in these elections. So it is an election that is anti-Bolsonaro, anti-PT. So that's the meaning of opposite for me. It's not in any way drawing any kind of false equivalence between the two, because that just simply shouldn't be done, given the kinds of things that Bolsonaro, which brings me then to your question, the kinds of things that Bolsonaro has been saying. I do believe these things are going to come back to haunt him, very much so. This is why I believe that a Bolsonaro government will be extremely turbulent. As for anti-Semitism, I don't know if Mauricio has anything to add on this, but I haven't really seen That hasn't been an issue. That has not been an issue at all in the elections. I mean, there's the issue of the evangelical vote, which is, more tied to Bolsonaro for sure than to anybody else. But as for anti-Semitism per se, no, that has not come up. As for your question on the possibility of having had a Ciro Haddad, ticket, to be quite frank, I don't think that would have been possible. The PT has a brand, a very strong one, that you either believe in or you don't. And Ciro Gomes, for all his faults, and he has many, just as every other politician in these elections do, and you can speak more broadly of politicians that way if you want to. He has been throughout his career. I mean, he says, his rhetoric is also very fiery, and he sounds very crazy a lot of the times. But in his public life, he's always taken a sort of a center to center left. Sometimes even the way Brazilian politicians are, they fluctuate all over the place. Maybe even center right in some occasions. So I do not see him, he would not have done that. He would not have associated himself directly with the PT, even though he does benefit from some of the PT vote, and he knows that. And he's been trying to, sort of navigate that very narrow, path. One thing that perhaps would have been really interesting to see, but I can't see, given the polarization in Brazil and how charged these elections are going to be from the outset, one thing that might have been really nice to see would have been a Marina Ciro ticket in whichever order that might come about. Either with Ciro as the head and Marina as the VP, or the other way around. That would have been really interesting to see. And that perhaps could have been a game changer in these elections. Who knows? But we haven't seen it, and we won't see it.
Because the non-PT and non-Bolsonaro are almost half of the country, but the center were not able to make just one ticket. That would be very competitive, but it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio. Yeah. This was terrific. And I've got to think again about the most surprising thing I think that comes out of here, frankly, is that there's really going to be a competitive election in the runoff. That this is not going to be an overwhelming for either side, and it's going to be a nasty election, probably even nastier than the last one. And thanks for telling us all this. Thanks.